On June 3rd through the 7th of 1942, the Battle of Midway took place. This battle was probably the most important battle in the Pacific for the U.S. It was this decisive battle that stunted Japan's expansion and reversed the Pacific's campaign's turnout for good. Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was the Japanese commander-in-chief of the combined fleet. By 1942, the Japanese had been victorious in claiming much of Southeast Asia and many Pacific islands with their invincible navy and other military forces. It was a rough couple of years for the Americans and especially for President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Japan's Pacific campaign was becoming a very scary threat to the U.S. as the Japanese grew closer and stronger every day. Following their overwhelming victories, the Japanese were feeling very optimistic. Isoroku Yamamoto sought to destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet while they were down so that they could secure their victories without the Americans interfering. Yamamoto also continued to expand Japan's defensive perimeter, and by attacking and taking over the little island of Midway Atoll, they would be able to quickly invade parts of Hawaii, which was only 1,260 miles away. If they controlled Midway, the Japanese would control all of the air and sea lanes west of Honolulu. Yamamoto's plan to attack Midway was to hold a sham flight towards Alaska to lure the U.S. fleet out of Midway and then invade Midway before the U.S. could do anything about it. If everything went as planned, the U.S. Pacific Fleet would arrive to a destroyed Midway. U.S. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, was newly put in after Admiral Kimmel was relieved of command just before this battle took place. Despite the low morale, the Americans did have one advantage up their sleeve. Under the direction of Commander Joseph Rochefort, the Combat Intelligence Office at Pearl Harbor had been working hard to break Japan's code. This complex and unpredictable code required men of genius to decipher, but it was done, and key bits of crucial information were given to Nimitz just in time. Because of the codebreakers, the U.S. anticipated the surprise attack. 3 heavy aircraft carriers of the U.S. Pacific Fleet awaited the Japanese carriers heading towards Midway. No matter how much the U.S. fleet knew about Japan's plan, it didn't quite outweigh the exemplary Japanese Zero fighter. These planes had a deadly combination of speed, power, and maneuverability. Also, the Japanese were much more experienced and had been much more victorious than the American pilots, who, most of which, had never flown in combat before. U.S. Admiral Raymond A. Spront was the commander put in charge by Nimitz to lead the strike force of the Battle of Midway. June 3, 1942, the first air attack by the Americans took off at 12:30, consisting of 9 B-17s. June 4, 1942. The U.S. knew that Japan's plan was to attack that morning. At 4:30 a.m., the first of the Japanese aircraft would lift off, and the little island of Midway came alive. At 5:52, Lieutenant Howard P. Addy, while flying, radioed that he had spotted the main Japanese carrier force. Franz didn't hesitate to launch. It was a critical decision, but also a deadly one. He sent the American aircraft to attack a target that was just outside of their combat range, and this sent many pilots to their deaths. There was no doubt he loved his men, but Franz knew what he was doing. Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron said in anticipation of the coming battle, "My greatest hope is that we encounter a favorable tactical situation, but if we don't and worst comes to worst, I want each one of us to do his utmost to destroy our enemies. If there is only one plane left to make a final run in, I want that man to go in and get a hit. May God be with us all." The Japanese bombed Midway, but didn't leave it critically damaged. After the last of Japan's carriers, the Hairu, had been destroyed, the reality of the outcome finally settled in. On June 7th, Japan's fleet was defeated. The Japanese military never recovered from this devastating event. The United States would now fight an offensive battle for the Pacific War.
This is how I show.